Emilius has always been the kind of person who couldn't resist looking behind the scenes of strange things. His childhood was marked by an endless search for the truth, hidden in the darkest corners of the internet. Forums on obscure sites, Reddit branches that were closed almost immediately after creation, archives of old news and abandoned blogs. Emilius was one of those who followed urban legends and rumors, finding it an adrenaline rush. Hank, his best friend since childhood, on the contrary, never believed in the supernatural or mystical. He was a man of logic, figures, and facts. Their strange friendship has always been built on opposites. Emilius was looking for the strange, and Hank was destroying it with his skeptical rationality. They met at university when they were both studying computer science, and it was a turning point in their lives. Emilius studied the dark corners of the network, while Hank created protection systems against such corners. Together, they decided to develop a platform for storing and analyzing those strange, mysterious data that Emilius had been collecting for years. The platform was codenamed Project Abyss. However, a few years later, when their research began to bear fruit, everything did not go as they expected. After the beta version was launched, users began to send their own creepy stories, many of which looked like ordinary cryptopasts. But soon, Emilius and Hank began to notice that there were certain connections between them. It seemed that some of the users knew too much. They unraveled long-forgotten or hidden chains of events, making Emilius wonder how real these stories are. Some of them mentioned mysterious disappearances, unexplained events, and random murders. All this could be written off as paranoia, if not for one but. The people from these stories really existed. Finding more and more matches, Emilius and Hank began to investigate themselves. They plunged into the wilds of the web, to those levels where rarely anyone dared to stay for long. On one of the forums, they came across a series of posts that looked like excerpts from personal diaries. These diaries described strange disappearances, bizarre phenomena, and frightening events that happened to various people around the world. The posts disappeared a few hours after publication, but Emilius managed to save them. It was at this point that they began to realize that everything was much more serious than just stories from the internet. Someone was clearly watching them, and not just online. After they saved the recordings, the strangest thing began. Both began to notice the same little things in their daily lives. Strange phone calls, cars that seemed to always follow them. Someone left strange objects at their doors, children's toys, scraps of old newspapers, photographs of strangers. This happened to both Emilius and Hank, independently of each other. The first disturbing note was a piece of yellowed paper found by Hank on the porch of his house. "You opened the door? Can you close it now?" These words looked like some kind of meaningless joke hint, but Emilius had the exact same note a couple of days later, with minor differences. "You opened the door, and now nothing will stop them." The oddities did not end there. Emilius's neighbors suddenly began to look at him as if they knew something he didn't know himself. Tension began to appear on Hank's face too, which he had not noticed before. Emilius decided to return to those forums to find any new traces or explanations of what was happening. One of the users, under the pseudonym Stranger001, began posting information that described in detail the daily lives of Emilius and Hank. The places they visited, the people they communicated with, right down to what they ate for dinner. This man knew too much, and it was a clear signal to them that someone was watching them. At some point, Hank tried to contact the site administrator to block the Stranger001 account. However, all attempts to delete or block access to the site failed. This was not an ordinary attack. Someone used hacking techniques that surpassed even their professional skills. Realizing that they were clearly into something more, Hank suggested suspending the project and disappearing from the network for a while. But Emilius was too involved. He felt that the solution was close. The next day, Hank disappeared, without warning, without a trace. Emilius tried to call him, but the phone was silent. There was no sign of a break, and in his house, although the door to Hank's apartment was open, and there was a strange order inside, all things were in place, food was cooked, the computer was on. The only thing that stood out was the new note left on the table. "They came for you. You've always been their target." Emilius was aware that this moment could be key. But who are they? And why would they need Hank? Or maybe they aren't after Hank at all. After that note, everything started happening faster. Strange things followed Emilus everywhere. Strangers on the streets started asking him strange questions, as if they knew him, but he couldn't figure out who they were. Several times he felt like someone was watching him in his own apartment. Only catching a glimpse of movement outside the window or a shadow in the mirror, he began to doubt more and more that something real was following him. But then he came across another Stranger 01 post, where it was written, "You won't escape them, and neither will he." You knew this would happen. Emilus was sitting in his apartment, pressed against the laptop screen, typing search queries with shaking hands. He understood that he could not stay here for long. They began to find him, and apparently, whoever was doing this knew his every step. The calls became more insistent, and now they were happening even at night. Unfamiliar numbers, empty silence on the other end of the line, sometimes a rustle, as if someone was breathing directly into the phone. It was driving him crazy. He began to put all the information into logical chains, trying to figure out what was going on. Whoever wrote these stories and posted them online was clearly more knowledgeable than they could have imagined. Stranger 01 knew too much about their lives. Hank didn't just disappear. It was as if he had been erased from reality. All files, photos, even documents related to Hank started disappearing from cloud storage and social media. It's as if he never existed. Emilus sat up all night immersed in research. He was going back to the earliest archives of the project, trying to find a clue. A few hours later, he managed to find several strange files that had previously been hidden from view. One of them contained a recording of a conversation that took place almost a year ago, long before they launched Project Abyss. In the conversation, Emilus and Hank discussed a strange series of events concerning the mysterious disappearances of users of certain internet forums. However, the recording did not only contain their voices. A third party also took part in this conversation. This voice was unfamiliar. He was cold, mechanical, and said things that none of them knew about back then. Emilus realized with horror that this recording was being made without their knowledge, and someone already knew what they were going to do. This voice spoke of the doors they would open, that all their actions would be carefully monitored, and that one day they would realize what a mistake they had made. Emilus froze at the thought that this had been planned long before their participation in the project. A new note left at his door made everything even more obvious. You've already been a part of this from the very beginning. They've always been watching you. They're closer now than you think. This was the last straw. Emilus, having collected all his belongings, decided to leave the city. He realized that maybe it was stupid, and wouldn't help him avoid those who were chasing him. But it was becoming too dangerous to stay here. He headed to the outskirts of the city, where he had an old friend, a former hacker, who could help sort out this situation and protect him from further attacks. When Emilus got to the place, his friend already knew that something was wrong with him. He immediately started asking what was going on, but Emilus was too scared to give a clear explanation. Instead, he just handed him a flash drive with that strange recording and asked him to figure out who could be conducting their negotiations and tracking their actions. They spent several hours working on recovering deleted data and trying to crack the encryption used in these strange files. At some point, lines of code appeared on the screen that none of them could explain. These were not just random characters. The code clearly had a structure, but no one knew where it came from. Suddenly, Emilus's friend abruptly stood up and looked at him with a terrifying expression on his face. "Emilus, this is not a code. It's them. They're watching us right now." Emilus looked at the screen, and at that moment noticed how someone remotely started controlling their computer via the internet. The screen blinked, and text appeared on the monitor. "You still don't understand. It was inevitable. Stay where you are. They are already here." At the same moment, the lights in the house went out, and they heard muffled footsteps outside the door. Cold sweat trickled down Emilus's back. Someone was outside. "We have to leave," his friend whispered, but Emilus knew it was too late to leave. They stayed in the dark, watching the door slowly open. The door swung open slowly, as if in slow motion. Emilus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The silence in the room was becoming unbearable, and the tension was building by the second. His friend was pressed against the wall, holding in his hand something that looked like a metal pipe, which he grabbed at random. But they both knew it wouldn't help. There was no figure in the doorway. It only increased the fear. Who or what opened the door? In the darkness, the silhouettes of the two men seemed insignificant in front of an invisible threat that seemed to fill the entire room. Emilus suddenly felt a growing sense of panic when he heard the creaking of the floorboards by the door. He wanted to turn his head, but his muscles seemed to refuse to obey. His whole being screamed, "Run!" But his legs refused to move. "Who's here?" his friend whispered, his voice trembling with tension. There was no response. Instead, a strange, metallic smell hung in the air, which was getting stronger by the second. It smelled of rust and something rotting. Emilus instinctively covered his nose with his hand, trying to suppress the gag reflex. But the smell was getting stronger, filling the room like a poisonous gas. He made their heads spin and their thoughts get confused. Suddenly, something started flashing on the computer screen, which had previously remained black. It was a strange, annoying blinking, as if someone was turning the screen on and off in quick succession. Emilus came closer and froze. A single phrase flashed on the screen. "Can you hear them?" And at the same moment, they heard it. At first, a faint whisper, barely distinguishable in the silence, but gradually it began to intensify, turning into a polyphonic choir. Whispers surrounded them from all sides, as if someone or something invisible was standing right behind them. The words were slurred, but clearly human. Someone was talking endlessly, and the sound was bone-chilling. Emilus's friend took a step back, but his foot caught on a chair, and he fell to the floor with a crash, knocking objects off a nearby table. Emilus turned around, and at that moment he saw something flash in the doorway, a shadow whose presence was barely perceptible. "Emilus, let's go, now," his friend shouted, getting to his feet. Panic gripped them both. They broke out of the apartment, running outside into the cold night. The cold wind was hitting them in the face, but at this moment it was better than that incomprehensible threat left in the house. Emilus looked back. No one was following them, or so it seemed. They ran through the streets, not taking apart the road. The panic was so strong that they did not notice anything around them. No people, no cars, no sounds of the city. Run, just run. To get as far away from that room as possible, from that strange shadow and the whisper that continued to sound in their heads, despite the fact that they were already far away. "Where are we running to?" Finally, his friend asked breathlessly, stopping in a narrow alley. Emilus didn't know. He had no idea what to do next. All he could do was try to collect his thoughts. He leaned against the brick wall and ran his hand over his face, feeling his body vibrate with adrenaline. "We can't go back anymore," Emilus said, breathing heavily. "There's something there. Something that's been following us since the beginning. But what? Who are these people? Or are they not people?" The friend looked just as scared. "We can't stay here. We need to hide somewhere, or at least find help." Emilus was silent, trying to make sense of the situation. His thoughts were confused, but one thing became clear. No one would come to their aid. No one but themselves could figure out what was going on. It all started with those strange posts on the internet, with those stories that seemed fictional. But now they were living in a nightmare from which there was no way out. And then Emilus remembered one detail that had seemed unimportant to him before. Among all the notes and messages, there was one strange place that was mentioned several times, an abandoned research station, left without public attention after a series of unexplained events. This place was outside the city, and it was rumored that experiments were being conducted there that no one was supposed to know about. This place was the last mention in many of those horror stories, and that's where people disappeared. "I know where we need to go," Emilus finally said, feeling a cold fear creep into his soul. "This is the only place where we can find answers." "Where to?" His friend looked at him with disbelief. "To the old station. She may be the key to everything that happens to us." The friend hesitated, but then nodded. They both knew they had no choice. You couldn't just hide or run away. They needed to find a solution to what was behind this whole nightmare, and they went to the station, which, according to rumors, was forgotten by everyone, but not by those who were watching them. They reached the old station in the dead of night. The place looked dead. Overgrown shrubs and rusty gates that never opened again created an atmosphere of abandonment and despair. The cold wind howled, but it was the only life in this gloomy corner. Emilis and his friends stopped in front of the building, looking at the dark windows as if something was hiding in them and watching them. "Are you sure this is the right place?" whispered a friend, looking around. The silence around them seemed to be pressing down on them. "Yes, here. This place was mentioned in every one of those stories," Emilis replied. His heart was pounding as if he had a premonition of an approaching nightmare. They climbed over the gate and slowly moved towards the building. With each step, the fear increased. The doors of the station were unlocked, and the creak of rusty hinges echoed through the deserted space like a cry for help. It was dark and damp inside. Every step echoed in the echoing corridors, and they both felt a chill creep over their hearts. The feeling that they were approaching something terrible did not leave Emilis. When they entered the main room, they saw a picture that froze their blood in their veins. The walls were covered with the very phrases they had seen on the computer screen. "Can you hear them? You opened the door. They're already here." But that wasn't the scariest part. On the floor, among the debris and old furniture, lay human remains scattered around the room. Bones, rotted clothes, and it's all covered in a layer of dust. They froze in place, unable to move. Someone had obviously been here before them. And apparently it was not an accident. What happened here? A friend whispered, looking at the remains. Emilis suddenly realized that they had been pawns in someone's game all this time. All of this, the website, the strange stories, the disappearances, the whispers in the dark, was a carefully planned trap. They themselves, without realizing it, opened the very door mentioned in the recordings, and now their end was imminent. Suddenly, there was a booming sound in the room, and the door through which they entered slammed shut. The lights flickered, and footsteps were heard in the corridors. They weren't alone. The whispers started to sound in their heads again. He was stronger now, clearer. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. "They came for us," Emilis said in a strangled voice, feeling cold terror paralyze his body. The footsteps were getting closer. The shadows in the corridors began to move, and something invisible, but certainly real, was coming at them. A feeling of hopelessness weighed on Emilis like a heavy weight. He realized that there was nowhere else to run. They got caught. The whispers grew louder, and it seemed that the whole air around them was saturated with this sound. These were not simple words. It was something ancient, unknown, incomprehensible to the human mind. And every moment they lost themselves, their minds became part of this crazy, multi-voiced whisper. The last thing Emilis saw before the darkness swallowed him up was a figure in a dark corner, standing motionless and watching them. Her eyes shone with a dim fire, and in those eyes there was an indescribable ancient hatred that left no chance of salvation.